Curtis Twinge lived in Avis his entire life. Born in Edmund Croft Hospital in nearby Whitney and carried helpless across the border into the belly. At 5 he was orphaned, first by his father who didn't come home, and then by his mother who told him not to make a sound. He spent 10 years in Avis House for unwanted children, at least that was what his cousin called it whenever he would go to his aunt's house for holidays. "You could live here, but we don't want you either," Kira would say as she squashed her unwanted peas on his shoulder at the dinner table. She would scrunch up her face when she looked at him as if he disgusted her. Avis House was a cornucopia of folk tales. Jealous children would spin tales to explain why they hadn't been adopted, why Annie or Lucy or John was gone but others were left behind. Annie was eaten by a witch. Lucy spontaneously combusted in her bed. That's why the adults had wheeled it out before the others woke up. John ran away. This one was true. But he was never seen or heard from again, so something wicked must have caught him in the woods. Curtis wouldn't sit with his peers in the circle on the floor, but he would listen to the stories and clutch his blanket to his chest, frozen still with fear and sweat building under his arms. Prospective parents never came, and yet children left. They never said goodbye, and sometimes they left their things behind, to be fought over by those who remained. Then one day Curtis left too. He wasn't expecting to leave, and so he left some things behind. He wondered if the other children, now in their early teens, would believe he had been adopted, or if he too would become a chapter of their lore. Truthfully, he had been hoping for a parent. It wouldn't have to be 2, just one or the other, man or woman, just someone to make breakfast and ask about his dreams. His mother used to ask about his dreams, at the breakfast table, eating porridge with applesauce and brown sugar, listening to Dad singing in the basement. But no one wanted Curtis, or ever would. A lawyer in a bright green suit the colour of a beetle was standing in the office when he walked in, impatient to leave. He handed Curtis some papers, and the lady in the office instructed him to follow the man out to his car. As he left Avis House, he heard the heavy wooden door slam behind him and the latch click into place. The lawyer walked to his car and got inside. He looked out the window at Curtis, standing dumbly with his papers in his hands, and sighed in frustration before rolling down the window. In not so many words, and with an expression of distaste towards the boy, the lawyer told him he had inherited his father's house. "Who will live with me there?" "No one," replied the lawyer. "Your aunt wanted the house. The judge said she had to take you too. She declined. You get the house." Curtis asked to be driven to the house, but the lawyer declined. "Not driving past the dead rats," he said. "Not driving through the weeping lakes," he mumbled to himself as he drove away from the lonely boy who nobody wanted. The house was by no means large, but the sheer excess of peculiarities lining the walls and piled up in the corners made it a labyrinth. Curtis remembered the bones of the place, but not the details. Not that he was interested to see them now. Books and loose pages filled with crudely hand-drawn pictures were strewn across the floors in every room. The crinkle of the paper as Curtis walked around aimlessly, searching for a place to sit, reminded him of dead leaves on the ground in autumn. He remembered his father chasing leaves in the wind, how he said it was good luck to catch one. But he never did. "What did you dream, Curtis?" he asked the kitchen as he kicked aside more dishevelled journals and plonked himself down in his mother's seat. The last time he had sat at the breakfast table in his father's house, he had been too small to use the grown-up chairs. Now he faced his high chair and tried to picture himself there. "I dreamed about a bird," he heard his own infant voice reply, before his father's voice interrupted. He would have liked to eat some porridge in that moment, even mourned the loss of dinner at Avis House, which was never particularly exciting. His stomach grumbled impolitely, and he rubbed it with his cold hands. His father's house was cold and damp now, not like it used to be. He began to think of where he would spend the night, and his memory, assisted by his traitorously vivid imagination, walked up the winding staircase, past some tall doors and into that room. He envisaged the wardrobe that his mother had pulled across the only window, blocking out any light that escaped the trees. He saw her press her finger to her lips and close the doors, drowning him in darkness before the sounds began. He shook himself free of the memory and lay his head on crossed arms on the table. This was exactly the position he found himself waking in 20 years later. The sound of thunder rocking through the rickety house and rain smattering at the thin glass windows. His back had suffered over the years from sleeping in corners like a mouse, or just strewn across furniture wherever his exhaustion found him, and so he winced and stretched and shivered at the cracking sound of his bones trying to realign. He never left the house. He barely opened the doors, and he didn't go upstairs. Those were the rules he had set for himself, his plan for survival. The older he got, the more he remembered, and he blamed the outdoors for his father's madness. His mother, he insisted, was not mad. She had not done the things they said she did, but she had left her mark on the second floor quite literally, so he would not go up there either. A milkman visited 3 times a week and left sufficient enough supplies that Curtis needed for nothing more. An expert might have said he needed sunlight or fresh air or human interaction, but Curtis would disagree. He spent his days organising the books and nights trying to outrun that pesky exhaustion. If he didn't sleep, then he wouldn't dream, and that was all he wanted now. Curtis knew from his short period of education at Avis House that people generally lived until their 80s, and that was with plenty of exercise and healthy foods. With no exercise and cheese sandwiches for dinner most days, he would probably only make it to his 60s, maybe 40s if he developed some kind of heart disease, so he wouldn't have to organise the books for much longer. No one ever came to the house. He didn't use the electricity, didn't even know if it worked. He used the water every now and then, but no one had ever asked him to pay a bill for it. He assumed people didn't want to walk through the woods, down to the murder house. Only the milkman came, and the milkman didn't seem to be afraid of anything. "You're an odd one," he had said to Curtis when they first met, and every other time they accidentally crossed paths, which wasn't very often. Curtis left money on the step and the milkman left a crate of goods, an ideal arrangement. "You're an odd one," Curtis said to the kitchen, and it replied with another burst of thunder and spatter of rain. He didn't know what time it was, but it was pitch black. Perhaps the moon would have provided a sliver of silver light, if not for the trees outside or the grime on the windows, but he didn't need light. He wasn't going to get up. He would sit at the table until he fell asleep again, or until the sun came up. The next spatter of rain was followed promptly by a blinding light that crept into every corner of the room and scared out a few nesting spiders. Curtis had closed his eyes and buried his chin into his neck to avoid the intrusion, but he had still glimpsed a shadow lingering by the window. Now, drenched in darkness again, he felt the shadow watching, and as he looked at the space he was sure it resided, he knew that it was looking back. He flinched at the next roar of thunder and felt a creeping sensation across his flesh. Who or what would be standing by his window in the midst of a thunderstorm and torrential downpour? Surely not a stranger seeking refuge from the rain. He wouldn't open the door if they knocked. He wouldn't move if they tapped on the window. He felt that familiar sweat building up under his arms, thinking back to the tales the orphans would tell of the creatures in the woods of Avis. "What did the bird say?" asked his mother from the darkness behind the pane of glass with the smattering rain and tap-tap-tapping. Curtis felt unconsciously propelled from his seat and towards the door of the kitchen. He closed it behind him and was alone in the darkness of the hallway. A moment to breathe in silence and sweep the sweat from his brow. His heart pounded and his mother's voice reverberated around in his mind. The litany, that was it. He wanted to repeat it. What the bird had told him in his dream, what his father sang in the basement, what his mother said. A creak at the top of the stairs sent him into a trembling whimper. He crumbled to the ground and buried his head in his hands. Curtis knew some of the upstairs windows were open because he would often hear things toppling over and shattering on the ground on windy nights. He heard the howl of the wind travelling through the rooms and down the hallways, and he occasionally heard birds come in and out. He would not go up to close the windows, even in the worst of winter, when the clothes his father left in boxes in the living room would barely suffice to stop Curtis from shivering. But it didn't matter now. After years of pretending there were no stairs, of averting his eyes and covering his ears, the sound of hooves slowly ascending those stairs grew ever closer. Whatever it was, it sounded heavy, like the aged wood could barely hold its weight. Sometimes the footfall sounded strong and solid, then the next was lighter, almost dancing across the step. Curtis began to crawl towards the living room with his eyes squeezed shut. He felt with his hands and tried to block out the sound, but he must have lost his sense of direction, because in 2 swift moves he reached out and touched the bottom stair. He flinched back as though it had burnt his flesh and cried out in horror. "No, no, 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 go away," he yelled, but was drowned out by another crash of thunder. He opened his eyes just as lightning pulled back the curtain of darkness and revealed his visitor just inches away from his face. It purred, then stretched out its wings and cracked its bones into place. It seemed to take up the space of a single step and yet somehow fill the entire house. Curtis could hear its hooves clicking on the tiles in the kitchen, its beak pecking at the window. "What did the bird tell you in your dream?" asked his mother from the creature's mouth. "Tell me," it said in Cousin Kira's voice now, and then the milkman's, and then the children at Avis House. It was breaking down into a shapeless mass of darkness, then building up again in a new image, trying a new voice. It was watching his eyes closely and learning from his reaction. It seemed to Curtis to be something very old and yet childlike. "I don't remember," he whispered from behind his hands where he was hiding. "Liar," said his father. "Scared, pathetic liar," said the lawyer. Curtis pulled away from the steps again and bumped into a stack of books in the corner. They toppled down all around him, falling open and blowing loose pages into the air where they seemed to hang unaffected by gravity. His father had had an obsession since the woods had touched him, since he came home scratching. He drew the same pictures of the same people, the church, the bird, the town, but only as he could see it, not as it seemed in the light of day. The cat looked at the pictures with shining eyes of glee. It smiled and grew bigger than any cat Curtis had ever seen. Its wings fluttered behind it, and Curtis could barely look. "You're a demon. You killed my mother." "And your father," it replied. "And you, just not yet." Now when Curtis sits in his mother's chair at the table in his father's house, he isn't sitting alone. His mother is there, and his father, and Cousin Kira, and all the chanting children from Avis' house. The books still need to be organised. The Bible, that was what it was. He had always known what it was, just couldn't see it. "Tell me the litany," it said.